The smell of dust and rotting food filled the alien market. Traders shouted prices, metal carts rattled over uneven stones, and the air was thick with heat. In the center, a young alien girl stood alone. Her body was small and thin, her skin smeared with dirt. She had no clothes, only bruises and marks that told a story no one cared to hear. She hugged herself, trying to hide, but there was no escape from the eyes around her. A group of vendors laughed loudly. One of them lifted a bucket and threw its contents at her. Dark sludge splashed across her chest and shoulders, sliding down her trembling arms. She did not scream. She had stopped screaming long ago. Another trader picked up a piece of spoiled fruit and hurled it at her face. The crowd roared with laughter. "Too dirty to touch," someone shouted. "Stay away or you'll catch her curse," another voice called. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the stone under her feet. Every sound felt like a knife cutting into her. She knew better than to beg for help. No one here would give it. She had been brought to this place to be humiliated, to be broken. From the far end of the market, a human man walked slowly through the crowd. He looked out of place, taller than most, wearing a clean, dark coat that looked warm enough to survive a storm. He carried no weapons in his hands, but something about his step made people move aside. He stopped when he saw her. For a long moment, he didn't move. His eyes studied her, but there was no disgust in them. There was something else, something she didn't understand. She turned her face away, ashamed to meet his gaze. The man stepped forward. The crowd noticed and began to whisper. "Foolish human. Doesn't he know? She's cursed. She's marked. He'll regret it." He walked closer until he was only a step away. She flinched, expecting another blow, another cruel joke. Instead, he took off his coat. The cold air bit into him, but he didn't hesitate. Slowly, he draped it over her shoulders. The fabric was soft, heavy, and warm. It smelled of fresh air and something clean, something she had almost forgotten existed. Gasps spread through the market. Some faces showed shock, others anger. One vendor spat on the ground. "You'll bring ruin on yourself, human," he yelled. The man ignored them. He bent down slightly so his eyes met hers. "Enough," he said, his voice steady. Her hands clutched the coat tightly. It was too big for her, but she pulled it around her body like it was a shield. Warmth began to seep into her frozen skin, and for the first time in days, she felt a little less cold inside. A rock flew from somewhere in the crowd, striking the man on the arm. He barely reacted. Someone else shouted for him to leave her. The noise grew, but he stood his ground, his presence like a wall between her and the world. Then he turned to the crowd. His gaze swept over them, and for a moment, the laughter died. No one stepped forward. No one dared. He placed a firm hand on her shoulder and began to guide her away from the center of the market. She stumbled at first, her legs weak, but his grip was steady. Each step felt unreal to her. She had thought she would die here, surrounded by hate, but now she was moving away from it. The crowd muttered behind them, but no one followed. The sound of voices faded as they moved through the narrow streets between the market stalls. Her heart pounded, not knowing where he was taking her or why. She wanted to ask, but the words stuck in her throat. When they reached the edge of the market, she risked a glance at him. His face was calm, but there was something hard in his eyes, like he had already decided something important. She wondered if he knew who she was, if he knew what it meant to help her. Finally, her voice came out as a whisper. "Why?" He didn't look at her. His hand stayed firm on her shoulder. "Not here," he said quietly, and kept walking. The narrow back streets were quieter than the market, but danger still clung to the air. The human's steps were steady, his hand never leaving the girl's shoulder. She clutched the coat tighter, feeling every pair of hidden eyes watching from dark doorways. Somewhere behind them, faint voices called out, carrying the tone of anger and curiosity. The road was uneven, lined with broken stalls and crates that had long been abandoned. The girl kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting someone to appear. Her bare feet made no sound on the cracked stone, but the human's boots echoed in slow, deliberate rhythm. He seemed unhurried, yet his eyes scanned every shadow, as if expecting trouble. At the mouth of a narrow alley, 3 alien youths stepped out. They were tall, with sharp ridges on their faces, wearing patched leather jackets. One leaned against the wall, spinning a metal rod in his hand. Another blocked the path ahead with a sneer. "Leave her here," the one with the rod said. She's not worth your trouble. The human didn't slow down. His grip on the girl's shoulder tightened, not painfully, but enough to keep her close. Move, he said calmly. The tallest of the three stepped closer, looking the girl up and down with a mocking smile. You don't know who she is, do you? You don't know what you're protecting. The human's eyes locked on the man's. There was no threat in his voice when he spoke again, only certainty. I'm not asking again. For a moment, the alley was silent except for the distant hum of market life. Then, without a word, the tallest youth stepped aside. The others followed, though their eyes stayed fixed on the human. As he passed, one muttered, "Dead man walking." The girl's heart beat so fast she could barely breathe. She didn't understand why they had let him through. She had seen men stronger than him beaten in these streets for less. She dared to look at him again, but his expression hadn't changed. They continued deeper into the maze of narrow streets. The smell of smoke drifted from somewhere ahead, mixed with the scent of damp wood. A stray animal darted across their path, disappearing into a hole in the wall. Every sound felt sharper now, as if the city itself was listening. Finally, they reached a quieter lane, with old stone houses pressed close together. The human stopped in front of a metal door, its paint chipped and faded. He knocked twice, a pattern that seemed too specific to be random. After a pause, the door creaked open, revealing a human woman with gray hair tied back and sharp eyes that softened when she saw him. "You brought someone," she said, her gaze flicking to the girl. "Do you know what this means?" "She needs a place," he replied simply. The woman's eyes lingered on the coat, then on the girl's bare feet and bruised skin. She stepped aside without another word, letting them in. The air inside was warmer, filled with the smell of bread and boiling soup. Wooden tables were pushed against the walls, and a small fire burned in a metal stove. Several other aliens sat quietly around the room, their eyes lifting to watch the new arrival. Some looked curious, others wary. The girl stayed close to the human, afraid to let go of his coat. She felt out of place, as if at any moment someone might tell her to leave. The woman gestured toward a bench near the stove. "Sit, warm yourself." She obeyed, still holding the coat around her like armor. The fire's heat reached her frozen fingers, making them tingle. She tried to focus on it, but the room felt heavy with unspoken questions. The human stood nearby, speaking in low tones with the woman. Their words were too soft to hear, but the way she glanced at the girl told her she was the subject of their talk. A sudden knock came at the door, 3 hard raps that made the girl's stomach twist. The woman froze, her eyes narrowing. The human's posture changed instantly, his hand brushing the inside of his coat where a concealed weapon might be. The knock came again, followed by a deep voice calling in an alien tongue. The girl recognized it. Her skin went cold. She whispered, "They're looking for me." The human met her eyes. "Then we don't open the door." The voice outside grew louder, demanding entrance. Someone else joined it, footsteps crunching on the street. The other aliens in the room shifted uneasily, some standing, others moving toward the back. The woman whispered something urgent to the human. He nodded, then turned back to the girl. "Stay close." He guided her toward a narrow hallway at the back of the room. The air there was colder, the floor uneven. They passed stacked crates and shelves filled with old supplies until they reached another door. This one was smaller, hidden behind a curtain. He opened it quietly. A narrow passage stretched beyond, leading into darkness. Without hesitation, he stepped inside, pulling her with him. The door closed behind them just as the front door burst open and voices filled the shelter. In the dark passage, their footsteps were the only sound. The girl's breath came in quick bursts. She didn't know where he was taking her, only that every step away from that voice felt like stolen time. The path curved and sloped downward until faint light appeared ahead. They emerged into the open air at the edge of the district, the sound of the market now a distant murmur. The girl looked back once, but the alley behind them was empty. The human kept walking, his coat still wrapped around her. He didn't speak, and neither did she. Words felt too small for what had just happened. The streets grew wider as they moved farther from the market district. The noise of angry voices faded, replaced by the distant rumble of wagons and the soft hiss of wind between buildings. The girl's bare feet stung with every step, but the coat kept the rest of her warm. She stayed close to the human, glancing at him every so often, as if to make sure he was still there. They turned down a road that led toward the edge of the city. Here, the buildings were smaller and older, their walls patched with mismatched stone. Smoke curled from crooked chimneys, and the smell of baked bread mixed with damp earth. The human slowed his pace as they approached a low, weathered structure with a faded sign above the door. He pushed the door open, and a wave of warm air rolled out. The girl hesitated in the doorway, blinking against the sudden change in light. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves stacked with jars, blankets, and small bundles. A fire burned in a corner stove, its orange glow casting long shadows. The place felt quiet but alive, like it was holding its breath. A young human man looked up from behind a counter. His eyes flicked to the girl and then to the coat wrapped tightly around her. "Another one?" he asked, his voice low. The older human gave a short nod. "She needs rest, food, safety." The younger man's gaze lingered on the girl's face before he gestured toward a table near the fire. "Sit there. I'll bring something." She moved cautiously, unsure if she was truly welcome. The wooden chair creaked under her as she sat. Her fingers gripped the coat's edges like they might vanish if she let go. The warmth from the stove seeped into her skin, chasing away the deep chill in her bones. The younger man returned with a bowl of thick soup and a slice of bread. The steam carried the scent of herbs and vegetables, making her stomach twist with sudden hunger. She stared at the food, uncertain. The older human gave her a small nod, and she took the first bite. The taste was simple but rich, and it burned pleasantly on the way down. She ate slowly at first, then faster, as if afraid it might be taken away. From the corner of her eye, she saw the two humans speaking in low tones near the counter. The younger one's face tightened as the older explained something. Every so often, they glanced at her, and she kept her head down. When the bowl was empty, she leaned back in her chair, her body heavy from the warmth and food. She was almost drifting into sleep when a sharp knock rattled the door. The younger man froze, his eyes darting to the older human. The knock came again, louder this time. A voice spoke in the alien tongue, deep and commanding. She stiffened instantly, her hand tightening on the coat. She knew that voice. It was from the market, one of the ones who had shouted for her to be left behind. The older human's expression hardened. He gestured for the younger man to stay put and crossed the room silently. Instead of opening the door, he moved to a small window beside it and peered out through a narrow gap. Two armed aliens stood in the street, their armor marked with the same crest that had been burned into her skin. They scanned the area, their eyes cold. One of them pounded on the door again. The human turned away from the window and walked to the girl. His voice was calm, but his movements were quick. "We're leaving. Now." She followed without question as he led her through a doorway at the back of the room. The younger man hurried ahead, pulling aside a curtain to reveal a hidden staircase. It was narrow and steep, leading down into darkness. The human guided her carefully, his hand steady against her back. The air below was cool and smelled faintly of stone and earth. Their footsteps echoed softly as they descended into a long passage lit by small lanterns. The walls were rough, as if carved in a hurry. "Where are we?" she whispered. "Old tunnels," the younger man answered quietly from ahead. "They run under most of the district. Few know they still exist." They moved quickly, the sound of muffled knocks still faintly reaching them from above. After several turns, the passage opened into a wider chamber where crates and sacks were stacked against the walls. A single wooden door stood at the far end. The younger man pushed it open, revealing a narrow alley on the other side. The air outside was sharp with cold, but it carried no sound of pursuit. The older human stepped out first, scanning both directions. When he was sure it was clear, he motioned for her to follow. They moved quickly through the back alleys, weaving between shadows until the shapes of larger buildings faded behind them. The streets here were quieter still, lined with small gardens and broken fences. Finally, they stopped in front of a low stone building with no sign, only a heavy wooden door. The human knocked in a strange pattern, 3 slow, 2 quick. After a pause, the door opened just enough for a face to appear. An elderly alien with gentle eyes studied the human, then the girl. Without a word, he stepped aside. Inside, the room was dim but warm. A fire crackled in a wide hearth, and the scent of clean herbs filled the air. Soft blankets were folded neatly on a table. The girl stood frozen just inside the doorway, unsure if this was another temporary stop or something more. The human closed the door behind them and finally spoke to her in a quiet, steady voice. "You're safe for now." She wanted to believe him, but the memory of armored figures in the street still burned in her mind. She tightened the coat around herself, as if its weight was the only thing holding her together. The firelight flickered against the stone walls, casting shifting shadows across the small room. The girl sat on the edge of a low bench, her bare feet resting on a woven rug that felt soft compared to the hard streets outside. The coat was still wrapped tightly around her, though the room was warm. The elderly alien who had opened the door moved slowly, placing a kettle over the fire and adding leaves that released a calming scent. The human stood near the wall, scanning every corner of the room, his body tense as if expecting trouble even here. The old alien looked at him and spoke in a low voice. "You've brought danger with you. I can see it in her eyes." "She's marked," the human replied. His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. The old alien's gaze shifted to the girl. "Show me." The girl hesitated, her hands clutching the coat. The human gave her a small nod, and after a long pause, she slowly loosened the fabric. Turning slightly, she let the coat fall enough to reveal her back. Under the dim light, the mark stood out, burned deep into her skin, still raw around the edges. It was an emblem made of sharp, cruel lines, a symbol of ownership and shame. The old alien's eyes narrowed. "That is the crest of the Vern Dominion." The human's jaw tightened. "So I was right." The girl quickly pulled the coat back around herself, her face pale. "They will find me," she whispered. "They always do." The human crouched in front of her, meeting her eyes. "Not if I can help it." The old alien poured hot tea into a cup and placed it in the girl's hands. "Drink. You will need your strength." His tone was gentle, but there was a shadow in his eyes. "You must understand, the Vern Dominion does not mark anyone without reason. You were not just a prisoner. You were a message." Her grip on the cup trembled. She didn't speak. The human asked, "What will they do if they catch her again?" The old alien's voice grew grim. "If she escaped after being marked, they will make an example of her. They will not kill her quickly." Silence settled over the room. The girl stared into the steam rising from her tea, the scent of the herbs almost enough to make her forget where she was. Almost. The human rose to his feet. "We'll need a safe route out of the city. Somewhere they won't expect." The old alien studied him for a long moment. "There is one way. It is dangerous, but if you wait until morning, you will not have a chance. They will search every street by then." The girl's chest tightened. She had been running for so long that the thought of moving again made her feel like she couldn't breathe. But staying meant worse. The human agreed without hesitation. "We leave tonight." The old alien moved to a small chest in the corner and opened it. Inside was a rolled map, old and frayed at the edges. He spread it across the table, the lines showing the streets, alleys, and forgotten tunnels beneath the city. His finger tapped a section near the outer walls. "There's an aqueduct here, abandoned for years. If you reach it, you can follow it to the forest beyond the city." The human traced the route with his eyes. "It's close to the patrol lines." "Yes," the old alien said, "but the Vern don't expect anyone to use it. The ground there is unstable. You'll have to move quickly and quietly." The girl set the cup down, her voice small. "Why help me?" The old alien looked at her for a long time before answering. "Because once, someone helped me, and because no one deserves the chains of the Vern." The human pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders. "We go now." The old alien handed him a small leather pouch. "Food for the road, and this," he placed a short blade in the human's hand. "You may need it before the night is over." They stepped back into the cold, the sky above dark and heavy with low clouds. The streets in this part of the city were nearly empty, only the wind moving between the buildings. Every step echoed too loudly in the stillness. The human led her through narrow passages, always staying in the shadows. Twice they had to stop and press against the walls as distant patrols passed by, their armor glinting faintly under the pale light. The girl's heart pounded with every sound. Once, they heard the deep growl of a Vern hound somewhere nearby. The human didn't stop moving, guiding her with firm, steady hands. Finally, They reached the edge of the district. Ahead lay a low stone channel, half covered with weeds and debris. Water trickled faintly inside, the sound echoing in the still air. The opening was just large enough for them to crouch through. The human glanced around, then motioned for her to follow. She hesitated for only a second before stepping into the cold, damp tunnel. The smell of moss and old stone filled the air. Behind them, the city was fading into silence, but she knew they were not yet free. The human's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Stay close. This is where they won't expect us, but it's also where we can't afford mistakes." She nodded, her fingers tightening on the coat as they moved deeper into the dark. The tunnel stretched ahead, narrow and damp, the sound of dripping water echoing from unseen cracks. The girl's breath formed small clouds in the cold air. Each step made her toes ache against the wet stone, but she kept moving, staying close to the human's back. The coat dragged slightly on the ground behind her, but she refused to let go of it. The walls closed in at some points, forcing them to turn sideways to squeeze through. The human moved carefully, his eyes scanning every shadow, his ears tuned to the smallest sound. Somewhere above them, faint thuds and muffled voices hinted at patrols moving through the streets. Down here, the air was heavy and still, but it carried the sense of being hunted. They reached a section where the ceiling dipped low, and the floor sloped toward a deeper channel filled with ankle-deep water. The human stepped in first, testing the depth before motioning for her to follow. The icy water bit into her skin, making her shiver, but she kept her balance and pressed on. The tunnel curved, opening into a wider chamber, where thin shafts of moonlight spilled through cracks in the ceiling. The light revealed old carvings on the walls, symbols she didn't recognize, worn down by time. The human paused, his eyes catching on something. He knelt and ran his fingers over the carvings before glancing at her. "These tunnels are older than the city." Before she could ask more, a faint noise echoed from behind them. It was soft at first, then sharper, the sound of something metal scraping stone. Her body tensed. The human's hand went to the short blade at his side. He motioned for silence, then guided her toward a side passage, half hidden behind fallen rubble. They squeezed through the gap, emerging into a narrow, sloping tunnel that seemed untouched for years. The smell of fresh air grew stronger, but so did the sound of movement behind them. They picked up the pace. The floor here was uneven, forcing her to watch every step. Twice she stumbled, but the human caught her before she fell. His grip was strong and steady, urging her forward without a word. The passage ended at a grated opening, blocked by rusted bars. Faint moonlight filtered through, and beyond it she could see open ground and the shadow of trees in the distance. The human tested the bars, solid but corroded. He pulled a small metal tool from his coat and worked at the bolts. The scraping behind them grew louder. This time, voices followed, low and guttural, speaking in the alien tongue. She recognized the tone. It was the same cruel rhythm she'd heard in the market, the same that had ordered her humiliation. The human worked faster, the old bolts groaning as he loosened them. The first came free with a snap, then the second. The voices drew nearer, their footsteps now distinct against the tunnel floor. With one final twist, the last bolt gave way. He pulled the bars aside just enough for them to slip through. The opening was tight, but he pushed her first, his hand steady on her back. She stumbled into the open air, the cold night wind hitting her face like a shock. He followed immediately, pulling the bars back into place to hide their escape. They crouched low in the grass outside, the sound of the hunters now muffled by the tunnel walls. The girl's heart pounded so hard she could barely hear anything else. The human pointed toward the line of trees ahead. "Move, quietly." They crossed the open ground quickly, their bodies low, the grass brushing against their legs. The forest loomed closer with every step, its dark shapes like a wall against the sky. The moment they reached the first line of trees, they slowed, letting the shadows swallow them. Inside the forest, the air was colder, filled with the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and stones. The human moved with practiced steps, avoiding anything that might snap underfoot. She followed his path, placing her feet where his had been. After several minutes, they stopped near a cluster of thick trees. The human scanned the darkness, listening. The forest was alive with distant sounds. rustling leaves, the faint hoot of a night creature, but there was no sign of pursuit yet. He turned to her. "We can't stay here long. They'll search beyond the walls soon." She nodded, though her body ached from exhaustion. Her eyes wandered to the coat wrapped around her. It was no longer clean. Mud streaked the fabric, and the hem was torn from dragging across stone and dirt. Still, it was the only thing that made her feel safe. The human crouched to check the ground, wiping away any trace of their footprints. "We'll head east. There's an old watch post there. If it's still standing, we can rest for a while." She didn't ask how he knew all of this. Somehow, it felt like he had always known where to go. They moved again, deeper into the forest. The moonlight barely reached through the branches, but the human's pace was steady, and she matched it as best she could. Her legs were trembling, but each step away from the city felt lighter than the last. Far behind them, faint and distant, a horn sounded. Her breath caught in her throat. The human didn't stop walking, but his eyes hardened. "They know we're gone," he said quietly. The sound faded into the night, but it stayed in her mind like a shadow that wouldn't leave. She pulled the coat tighter and kept moving, knowing that as long as she stayed with him, she still had a chance. The forest seemed endless, the trees stretching high and close, their branches weaving a roof that blocked most of the moonlight. The air was colder here, carrying the smell of damp soil and wet leaves. The girl's feet ached with every step, but she forced herself to keep up with the human ahead of her. He moved quickly, but with care, avoiding thick roots and loose stones that could make noise. They had been walking for what felt like hours when the human finally slowed. He raised his hand, signaling her to stop. She froze, listening. At first, she heard nothing but the faint rustle of leaves. Then, somewhere behind them, a twig snapped. The human's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer to her and spoke in a low voice. "They're tracking us." Her chest tightened. She gripped the coat tighter, feeling the warmth of it against her skin. The human looked around, scanning the forest. His gaze settled on a faint path leading off to the right, barely visible under the leaves. Without another word, he guided her onto it. The path was narrower and overgrown, forcing them to push past hanging branches. The sound of movement behind them grew louder, the faint metallic clink of armor carrying through the night. The girl's breathing quickened, but she kept her steps light, copying his careful movements. After several minutes, the path ended at a steep slope that dropped into a shallow river. The water glistened faintly in the moonlight, its surface broken by scattered rocks. The human glanced back toward the sound of their pursuers, then down at the river. "They won't expect us to cross here," he said. "The current is cold and fast, but it's shallow enough to walk." She hesitated at the edge, the rushing water looking darker and deeper than he made it sound. But the voices behind them were getting closer. Without waiting, he stepped into the water, gripping her arm to pull her in with him. The shock of the cold was immediate, biting into her legs and stealing her breath. She stumbled, but his grip held firm. They moved carefully, placing their feet on the large rocks under the surface to keep balance. The water swirled around their knees, tugging at the coat, but she clung to it with one hand. Halfway across, a shout rang out from the trees. Figures appeared on the far bank they had left, their armor catching the moonlight. One of them raised a weapon. The human's pace quickened, pulling her forward through the icy current. A sharp crack split the air as a projectile struck the water beside them, sending up a spray. The girl gasped, nearly losing her footing, but he steadied her and pushed forward. Another shot came, this one hitting a rock just ahead. They reached the opposite bank, scrambling up the slippery mud. The human turned briefly, his eyes locking with the figures across the river. He knew they wouldn't risk crossing here. Not yet. The current was too strong, the rocks too slick. "Keep moving," he said, his voice steady but urgent. They pushed deeper into the forest, the sound of the river fading behind them. The cold from the water clung to her legs, but she didn't complain. Every step put more distance between them and the hunters. After some time, they came to a small clearing where a broken stone structure stood, half covered in moss. It looked like it had once been a watchpost, though now only the lower walls remained. The human led her inside, scanning the shadows before finally letting her sit on a flat stone. She sank down, pulling the coat around her tightly. The warmth was slow to return, but it was still the only shield she had against the chill. The human crouched nearby, listening to the forest. "Will they find us here?" she asked softly. "Not tonight," he replied. "We'll rest until dawn. Then we move again." She nodded, though sleep felt impossible. The forest was too quiet, and every rustle in the leaves made her tense. But the human's presence beside her was steady, like a wall against the fear. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the distant call of a night creature. The moon shifted above, casting pale light over the ruined stones. At some point, exhaustion overcame her, and her eyes closed. When she woke, the first light of dawn was filtering through the trees. The human was already on his feet, watching the forest. His coat was still draped over her shoulders, and she realized he had spent the cold night without it. "Time to go," he said, offering his hand to help her stand. She took it, her legs stiff from the cold. The forest ahead looked endless, but she felt a flicker of hope. As long as she kept walking beside him, there was a chance they could make it beyond the reach of the hunters. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Thin beams of sunlight broke through the canopy, painting the forest floor in shifting patterns. The human set a steady pace, moving quietly over the uneven ground. The girl followed closely, the coat wrapped tight around her, its weight both a comfort and a reminder of the night before. The forest was waking. Small birds flitted between branches, and the sound of water trickled somewhere ahead. The girl's legs were heavy from exhaustion, but she didn't complain. She knew stopping too long could mean capture. The human's eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, his hand never far from the short blade at his side. They reached a narrow stream and followed it upstream toward higher ground. The water was clear and cold, reflecting the pale blue of the sky. As they walked, the girl's mind kept drifting to the city they had left behind. She wondered if the hunters were still searching or if they had already spread into the forest. Half an hour later, the human raised his hand, signaling her to stop. He crouched low, listening. Somewhere in the distance, faint voices echoed, carried by the wind. The language was unmistakable. It was the same harsh tongue she had heard in the market, the same that had ordered her humiliation. "They're close," he murmured, "but the sound is coming from ahead, not behind." Her stomach twisted. "They're in front of us?" He nodded. "A patrol, maybe trying to block the way." Instead of retreating, he veered off the path, leading her through thicker undergrowth. The branches clawed at her arms, but she kept moving. They pushed uphill, the ground soft and uneven, until the trees thinned enough to reveal a rocky ridge. From here, they could see a section of open land below, a hunting party of Vern soldiers moving in formation, scanning the forest edges. The humans studied their movement for a long moment. "We can't outrun them in the open. We'll have to go around, through the ridge." The climb was slow and dangerous. Loose stones shifted underfoot, and the drop to one side was steep enough to make her dizzy. At one point, she slipped, and his hand shot out, catching her wrist before she could fall. He pulled her close, steadying her until her balance returned. They followed the ridge for what felt like hours, always keeping low to avoid being seen from below. The wind up here was sharper, carrying the scent of rain. Clouds gathered in the distance, their dark edges creeping toward them. When they finally descended back into the cover of the trees, the first drops began to fall. The human quickened his pace, knowing the rain could hide their trail but also make the ground treacherous. The forest grew darker as the clouds thickened overhead. The rain soon turned into a steady downpour, drumming against the leaves. The girl's hair clung to her face, and the coat grew heavy with water, but she refused to take it off. Through the blur of rain, they spotted an old wooden structure ahead, a small cabin, half collapsed but still offering some shelter. The human led her inside. The roof leaked in places, but the walls blocked the wind. He set down his pack and began checking the windows, making sure none were broken enough to give away their presence. She sank to the floor, her back against the wall, shivering from the cold. He returned with a bundle of dry twigs he had found under a ledge outside. With careful hands, he built a small fire in the stone hearth. The flames grew slowly, filling the cabin with faint warmth and light. The girl's eyes followed him as he worked. "Why do you keep helping me?" she asked softly. He didn't look at her at first. Because no one else would. She lowered her gaze. It will cost you your life. Maybe, he said, feeding another stick to the fire, but it will cost me more to walk away. They stayed in the cabin until the rain eased. When they stepped back outside, the air was fresher, the forest floor glistening with water. The sound of distant movement had faded, either masked by the rain or carried away by the wind. They walked for the rest of the day, stopping only briefly to drink from the streams they passed. The forest gradually began to thin, the trees shorter and spaced farther apart. In the late afternoon, they reached the edge of a wide valley. Beyond the valley lay rolling hills, and far in the distance, the faint outline of mountains. The girl stopped, staring. "That's outside the Dominion's reach, isn't it? For now," he replied. "Once we cross those hills, they won't be able to send patrols after us without risking open conflict." The thought of safety felt unreal. She turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "We can really make it?" His eyes met hers. "We will." They descended into the valley, the grass soft under their feet. The sun broke through the clouds, casting light over the hills ahead. She glanced down at the coat wrapped around her, torn and dirty, but still holding its warmth. She realized then that it wasn't just a coat. It was the reason she was still alive. And as long as she walked beside the human who had given it to her, she believed she would keep surviving.